Good afternoon, all. First, my apologies for only coming at the last minute. It was all I could manage. I had so much to do I couldn't otherwise do. Second, do appreciate how much I appreciate having the incredible privilege of being able to talk to you guys at all in the first place, which is remarkable. It was 2 years ago that I first met Nick and Nikki, who suggested I come, and that was a fantastic opening up for something that I'd had on my mind for 30 years, and the guy who invented it. I talked about it, made a website, etc., but I didn't think he explained himself, and I found it very exciting. So, he's called Greaves, and what I'm doing today is going over this sort of last point of it. You'll find a very quick summary of what he's saying at the beginning. I'm looking at examples of his interactions to see if anybody, that's you people, can actually come up with a mathematical way of expressing this proposed effect, which, if it's true, is totally remarkable. If it's not, it's sort of entertaining. But it's probably totally remarkable. He says that there is transmission of form when you get to near singular degrees of repetition. This starts off at a subatomic theory level. A couple of funny quotes here. Nature abhors a singularity. That, by definition, is the nature that we know, because beyond the singularity, there's another nature. And what I read this morning, the power of a theory is exactly proportional to the diversity of the situations it can explain. Like this lady here, who is was Nobel-winning economist. Right. So recap, 2015, I came here and I presented this theory in public for the first time ever. I concentrated on how exciting it had been in 1979, all that time ago, to see a non-scientist, who was a law graduate, come up with something which Arthur Koestler supported and encouraged his work. A letter showed you the letter from him, and on which at least one Nobel physicist complimented him and gave him advice, although with certain cautions. Last year I came back with a request for you to try to express mathematically the factor in the theory that concerns degree. It's going to be degree of repetition, degree of similarity. Two of you expressed enthusiasm, I remember it, but nobody got around to taking it further, so I'm having another push to see if by being a little tiny bit more intelligent and articulate than last year, I can get somebody to say, hey, I can do that. So I'm presenting the challenge in a little more detail, hoping to excite someone to create a new calculus, maybe an old calculus that applies to it. This is what Greaves' hypothesis is. Patterns repeated in time reproduce themselves across space. What? Patterns repeated in space reproduce themselves across time. A pattern can be arrangement in space, that's what we mean by pattern normally. It can be arrangement across space and time. But an event can be an arrangement across time. What might that be? An electron passing a point in a wire, repeating. And this is derived on the next page from event 4, events at a subatomic scale. At that scale, for two patterns to be similar means, I learn from you guys and from everybody because I'm very, very ignorant, that means that waveforms are similar. We'll get on to how similar they can be next page. But a waveform is a thing to do with probabilities. It's not really even a physical thing, if I'm understanding it right. So we can say the effect occurs when patterns of probability are similar, when some way interact. And it's just events being similar or arrangement of particles being similar. No, we can move on from particles to something called waveforms, which are something to do with sets of probability, which we don't really understand.
The probabilities themselves depend on similarity.
Oh, I like it, yes. That's you're giving me the language. Turns this stuff inside out for me. Yes. Okay, where did I go to? Hence, perhaps the effect applies when this is actually not very well written this line. The scale of repetition is so massive as to establish patterns of similarity that are near singular. But I think you'll pick up what I mean by that as we go through this. How did he come with this? He got it like this. He started off, in fact, not with Pauli, but with Heisenberg. And it was Luke Huffman who said, you can use Pauli instead, which I didn't know last year. By Pauli's exclusion principle, no two waveforms can be the same. Heavy quotes. If they were the same, the situation would be an impossible one, a singularity. What happens close to singularity? The physics that we know changes, we don't know how. Hypothesis. You can state that as nature abhors a singularity, the nature that we know. if the singularity were to happen, one could expect some kind of rupture of what we regard currently as reality. As a guess, this might take a form of energy being released. We see it in nuclear rearrangements of nuclear things, nuclear reactions, or some other completely unexplained effect which we can't easily predict. Okay, so he makes a proposal. Faced with this difficulty, when two things are very close to being similar, so close that it's close to a similarity, nature executes a jump across outside the confines of time and space as we know them. I'm wondering how ridiculous you're thinking that statement is, and I'm going to show you an example of it on the next page that you all know from every day. I hope I can make that point. It makes a jump in which one of the structures is transmitted either across either time or space to a situation where that similarity has been shunted off and no longer threatens the initial situation. As Greaves invents it, it happens a millionth of a second afterwards or before, but I think it's a bit specious because he's already playing with time. So far it's just an interesting hypothesis. And I'm going to ask you, not so much to believe it, but to see if you can help have a go at it numerically, or with whatever passes for numbers in advanced mathematics. So we're going to talk about scale. At the subatomic scale, we're going to talk about how he derived it at the subatomic scale, and whether or not it's arguable that it applies to things happening at a macro scale. When one waveform of a particle, we call particles, call them waveforms, is similar to another, one can visualize what you mean by that. This thing is similar to that thing. It's a one-to-one situation. You can visualize it. You can visualize what the exact similarity might be. In a one-for-one similarity of two elementary particles, shall we say, the degree of similarity is high. We always used to imagine that they were all the same anyway. Now we know each one's a waveform and they're all different. It's easy to hold the concept of a situation in which the degree of similarity becomes absolute or near absolute. You can take that in. So one-to-one things becoming very similar. The conception of the two waveforms or particles being the same is almost mathematical simplicity, easy to understand. If we look instead and just take it up a step at a time, a set of two particles, each having a unique probability function, we see that the letters are too small. The chance, the infrequency, the unlikelihood of one two-particle group being 100% similar to another is already multiplied by some factor. I mean, maybe an enormous factor, maybe an understandable factor, but mathematical mind might be able to answer that. How do we express that factor, that difference, that scaling? Is it exponential? Is it scalar? Is it something much more complicated than that and so on? So the question, what mathematical device or expression, or manner of expression or whatever, would enable us to express the degree of similarity between two waveforms, called it two particles, called it two waveforms, or two probability functions, or, getting more complicated, two particle sets. That's just stepping it up from one, which you can understand, being similar to another. 2 times 2, is it 2 factorial? Is it 2 to the millionth? What is it? Two groups, each comprising two particles. So I say that might be the first concept step in establishing a calculus to be used to achieve a manner of quantifying similarity. I'm hoping my next thing will be about this PhD, the statistics PhD, who told me to start from Newton with 2 points on the plane. Yes. You may remember last year I reported the following conversation. I was in Cambridge in the house of an astrophysics professor who has a name like Heine, but I don't remember it exactly. And so I got these guys over the wine with the following question. First I put the whole question of this, when I was expressing it only with particles. I put this whole subject of theory and the possibility of creating a calculus for it to 2 Cambridge astrophysics professors. One called McMahon, who was a very amiable guy, said, "That's gobbledygook, nobody talks about particles anymore." So I was appropriately brought low by that. On the other hand, just take the word particle and put wave function instead, and you can start to talk about it. It becomes much more interesting. The other guy said, I asked him, can you make a mathematics of similarity between systems, so within systems, in some way measure how similar they are? Those two are much more similar than those two. Can it be done? He said, impossible, too many variables, impossible. So that was coming from the professor. Then I asked a 30-year-old statistics PhD. Statistics, she said, it's simple. You do what Newton did. Start the x and the y-axis, 2 points. Talk about what changes have happened. So I rather like that approach, but of course it didn't really know what to do. So that's why I'm starting here from first 2 waveforms, one waveform similar to one other, then going on to 2 that are similar, then going on to 2 pairs that are similar or not similar, comparing how it's done. And I'm asking by what method we would quantify the degrees of similarity between the resulting probability functions, whatever they are. This is somebody who knows absolutely nothing about probability functions. So what's my next thing? Oh, you take this. So what this is about is taking it into the macro sphere. I haven't yet shown you, yes I have, how he derived it. He derived it from things that happen at a subatomic level. In that universe, it's a jolly good idea, but are you telling me that's going to happen at the macro level? Of course not, because it's all going to be too complicated. Or is it? Into the macro, once we have established that it's possible to envisage a degree of similarity between one set made up of 2 waveforms and another made up of 2, we then need the mathematical analysis, from the mini to the Mac truck, on how to expand this ability to quantify, which we worked out here because this is very clever, to this calculus, you might call it, to cover a number, n, an enormous number of sets of waveforms, each containing a number, each containing a subnumber of waveforms in them. In other words, how do you do this mathematics to talk about how similar these systems are? Can anybody build that for us? So, why is this relevant? Greaves' conjecture is that his hypothesis can be seen in action. So for somebody who's a really old hat, in at least 3 phenomena of daily life for which we have no explanation whatsoever. There's going to be a bit of reaction on the electromagnetism. The phenomenon, electromagnetic induction, operates across space. Yes, it does operate across space, we think. The phenomenon reproduction of shape in life forms, that tree and its seed making another oak leaf the same shape. My nose being the same as my father's, operates across both time and space when you go into think about it. Something called memory, without which we wouldn't have a civilization or even hardly any abilities, is actually a complete mystery to us, but Greaves explains it. Easy. It is a transmission of form across time, from my brain yesterday to my brain today. Okay, start with number 1. In an electromagnetic induction, an event pattern at one place is repeated to a degree that frankly borders on singularity. Electrons going down the wire, hundreds, millions, thousands of them per small unit of time. That's an enormous degree of repetition of something. If there were particles and all particles were the same, it would be a huge degree of repetition. So each one's got a different wave function, but something about them is the same. That thing happens again and again to a degree that is almost indescribably, unbelievably similar. He says that's a singularity. He says, what's going to happen if I get close to the limits of physics by doing that? Something totally inexplicable is going to happen. How about, have I written it here? Yeah, I've said all that. Somewhere over here I've written, oh yeah, something inexplicable happens at a distance. How does that happen? What's that? Something completely inexplicable by our normal physics actually happens. Of course, we live with it every day, we're using it all the time. But it's totally unbelievable. You can talk about Maxwell and put numbers to it, but it's totally unbelievable. Oh, that's the position. See how what I've left out here? And then it's a pattern having a point, succession of instances, to what extent electrons are similar. When we still saw it as a particle, it's easy to imagine that it was one was similar to another. Now we see it as a probability distribution. We have to assess how similar is the repetition of the event of the same type of particle distribution. Probability distribution, which we call an electron, passing through a single point when it's now a distribution and not a particle. Okay. Should not be beyond our capabilities of all of you, not me, to turn that, to produce the mathematics to express that. Bit of a challenge, but the type of event that calls it, I'm inventing calling it a singularity approach event, or SAE, actually, don't use that again, what we see when we do this with electromagnetic induction is an influence pops up at some other point in space. That's the dramatic thing I just said. Distant from the point of the repetition, if any set of electrons is moving down a fixed wire, a force will, at another place, a force will be exerted on that structure. That's completely inexplicable, folks. So, outside our physics, definitely, outside our expected physics, nothing predicts it, nothing explains it, it's a candidate for a singularity effect. Therefore, Greaves' explanation is elegant. It's got that going for it. The actual challenge I'm bringing today is to evaluate to what extent that the correspondence that is derived can be extended to scales way larger than the subatomic. I mean, the example I've given you, the two electrons, I think works very well, but what happens when you try to use that to explain why an oak tree's leaf is the same as its father's, and why a frog comes out the same as a frog? And the reason for that being important is, he doesn't explain, I'm repeating it of course, he doesn't explain only electromagnetic induction, what we call this, but these other two things as well. In the single particle example, we have to evaluate only the similarity involved when there's a repetition of only that one PD, probability distribution, passing that point. When we see the sets of two particles, we can say the degree of similarity is diluted, okay? When the single thing that passes the point a million times, so we're still in the end here, we can say that this high degree of repetition, which nature adores, is the cause of the phenomenon. Not a bad hypothesis on a quick first look. And when we seek to examine the two-set situation, we see that the degree of similarity begins to look something more like a degree of correspondingness of probabilities. Is that what it is? I hope you'll be able to tell me. But hang on, we have another effect here. We know that the number of times something is repeated, the more you repeat it, the more it becomes a potential, the more the similarity is happening.
Can I stop you for a second? Because, what do you mean by similarity? And I know you say, I hope you can tell me, but you're asking the question. So it's like it's asking the question about something that none of us are clear about.
The answer starts with a sort of fairground idea. This ball is the same as that ball. If they're exactly the same, that's a similarity. But of course they're not, because they've got these atoms in them. But if they were two probability wave functions and they were the same, that would be a similarity, because Pauli apparently says they can't be.
Yeah, but I mean,
that would be a singularity because he says they can't be similar.
Yeah.
So it's when a repetition becomes extremely exaggerated across time by being repeated a lot, or multiplicity of repetition of it in space, which is what happens in your DNA.
All right, but similarity is a very fundamental thing, and it underpins our understanding of information, it underpins our understanding of probability, it understands our understanding of induction. All of these things are really quite, these are very difficult questions. And
I think I could say, I'm just inviting you to take the simplest possible meaning in which, quote, two things are the same. Okay, let's go into that sort of, into the architecture of that statement. But
I think that's what we need to do, really.
I'm saying when the thing is repeated, you can say that the event was similar to the previous event. When there are millions of copies of the same molecule in your body, we can say that's a high degree of similarity between them all. What he's saying is that when you get close to a degree of similarity that becomes almost singular, something pretty strange is going to happen.
What does he mean by similarity?
Exactly what I just said. He perceived, he started off thinking, oh, two atoms. That was before anybody who was a layman thought about wave functions.
All right. But is he right?
How do we know? I mean, all he's got is a theory that puts three things that happen in real life that we observe that we can't explain as an explanation for all of them. And that's quite an elegant joke if it's no more than that. But it might be something more than a joke.
The purported explanation that you've just given, that you say he gives, just seems to be no more than a reformulation of the problem in the case of the business of inherited morphology. And surely, logically, the notion of similarity is parasitic on our prior grasp of the notion of identity and difference.
Absolutely.
Exactly. I mean, similarity is just degree of difference. If we didn't have a prior grasp on of what it is to be the same or different, in some sense, absolutely, of objects in some purely logical, notional sense of object, how could we speak of similarity or degrees of similarity?
In high philosophy. I mean, this
Well, I'm taking very old philosophy, if you want to call Leibniz high philosophy, but there are some very deep minds who have thought about this problem over the history of philosophy. Leibniz is the first that obviously comes to mind. Well, that could be, but there's a whole debate in the literature in philosophy physics about Leibniz, about whether Leibniz is whether thinking about bosons, for instance, elementary particle, so-called identical particles in quantum physics, actually forces us to give up Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. There's a whole literature about this. But I don't think it's illuminated by trying to bring in the notion of similarity as if it were itself a kind of absolutely primitive, undefined notion. Because it seems so plainly parasitic on the more fundamental notion of, logically more fundamental notion of identity or difference to begin with.
I didn't quite catch up the time.
Sorry, I say the notion of similarity, I'm sorry, I'm just repeating my point, but the notion of similarity just seems inherently parasitic on having a prior grasp of the notions of identity and difference in the first place.
Well, I'm looking at it very simply. If that thing is very similar to that thing, if it's exactly the same as that thing...
Well, how can it be exactly the same without actually being the self-same object? The very self-same object? The numerically identical thing?
Answer. It's in a different place.
Well, then it's not the same thing, is it? There's a predicate which distinguishes between the two of them.
It gets very complicated when you get to
it's very
reference again into
logically, it's as simple as it can get. It's just a two-place predicate which is holds of the one and not of the other.
Well, that sounds like it's a good solid sledgehammer and well crafted.
Well, not crafted by me. I mean, crafted by Leibniz and other people who thought about it a long time ago.
I think the difficulty here is in formulating the question.
Yes.
Good.
And I agree that similarity is a hugely difficult question.
Yeah, that's good.
I actually prefer analogy is it was the people who thought about probability that sort of started to really think about this. John Maynard Keynes' book on probability from the 1920s is an excellent starting point to think about similarity. David Hume's work is a very good point to think about similarity. The people who were sceptical about everything, I think...
I don't see why it's so...
I certainly agree the notion of similarity is a very tricky and very difficult one, and it may just conceivably be there has been a tradition, an alternative tradition in Western, perhaps even more in Eastern metaphysics, that it is possible to think the notion of similarity without having a prior presupposition, without having a presupposition about the notions of identity and difference. And actually David Bohm, David Bohm's whole business about order and order and disorder, he thought the notion of order was more fundamental really than the notions of, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the whole tradition which assumes some background notion of objecthood given in advance, and that therefore assumes the notion of similarity is parasitic on that of identity or derivative from some prior grasp of the notion of identity and difference, is challenged by Bohm in his writings about order. And he does actually specifically talk about degrees of similarity in that context. So I think there is a literature here, which in fact people in ANPA years ago, like Arletta Griffith, were struggling to develop some of those ideas. So there is a history here. I'm not saying that the questions you're asking are not very deep and important questions, but
I'm glad to hear there's a literature and it's obviously absolutely spectacular. I should read Hume and Keynes and anybody else.
No, it's just about. I think there's need to slow down a bit. I think that's the thing. We just need to take our time a little bit.
Yeah, someone who's got the chance to talk to 18 scientists and mathematicians, never having done anything like it before, has a tendency to want to blurt it all out in 2 seconds. Yeah. You don't know, as a non-presenter of theories, a non-processor of mathematical stuff, how carefully you should lay out the steps. So now I'm doing it very fast, sort of almost in quotes and almost in analogies, to see if I manage to get through to somebody. And I probably ought to take 200 pages.
Well, the problem is so difficult, we need some deep breathing.
Yes.
We do have a high degree of similarity in some cases. For example, coherent, when things are coherent, that's a high degree of similarity. When you've got things like lasers, the bosons in a laser, the bosons in a Bose-Einstein condensate, showing a high degree of similarity. And we get massive enhancement usually in those cases. I don't know what happens in any other.
That sounds like an example that doesn't fit in here.
There's a whole...
It doesn't produce any action at a distance or other extraordinary...
There are extraordinary things result from it. Certainly from Bose-Einstein condensates, you get conductivity.
Yeah, but they result... Oh, I see.
Yeah,
They result within the actual thing.
Yeah.
And this whole notion of indistinguishable particles, which in fact people have talked about in the
Yes.
past, including here at ANPA. I don't think we should get hung up on choices of terminology, but at the same time, choices of terminology can be very important. I think this notion of similarity is way too wide, and to me it seems a weaker notion than the one that we need to be getting at.
We'll change the word. Can I go on a bit, see what I managed to write down here? Quite sure what I was. I'm saying it's no longer a degree of quote similarity between a couple of objects. It's between some very complex fields. How do they correspond? Oh, what did I do there?
I don't know what you've done then.
I think it was an action across time and space.
Yeah, it's actual distance. Perhaps not passionate distance, irritation distance.
Bad robot.
Come up again, is that?
I think it's not, it's going to sleep because...
I felt it too long, I kept my finger on it. Okay, so what do I say here in this line down here? The number of times something is repeated becomes a factor. You can talk about my two subatomic particles showing something because they get very close to each other. But talk about two apples. You say, no, it's rubbish. I mean, look at that. Every one of them has a trillion atoms in there. That's ridiculous. But I'm saying if you get enough repetition between the patterns, between all those millions of apples or other things, I should say, maybe that too is repetition of a probability function or probability outline or shape of a probability or something, and that builds the same effect. So how would that happen? Let me introduce my next two guests. They are the DNA molecule and animal brain cells. Right? This is, what is that? Strictly Come Dancing. These are the two next guests. The DNA molecule, the first side, has a higher claim to the status of a device for creating degrees of similarity, so that, in this case, reproduction, transmission of form across space and time, can take place. What it's got? It's a spiral that's got the shape of its spirality. It's repeated and repeated and repeated. The sequences, many of them are repeated to a high degree, I imagine. The cross-sectional shape of it and other elements of its structure perhaps are massively repeated in each molecule. It itself is an exercise, an enormous degree of repetition, just one molecule. But not only is it that, but in each body, look this up a week ago, there are a vast quantity at the individual event situation. The event situation, where we're looking for the result, is where there's a cell, or some piece of living thing, and it can grow in any direction. Where does it get its information from? I say it gets its information from, if you know the story, you'll laugh at me, call it the Akashic Records. The fact that that was what happened last time, and millions and millions and millions of times before. And the fact that the ability to have that effect comes from the fact that there are millions of this fellow, this atom, this molecule, hanging around this body at once. Human body has perhaps 1.3 times 10 to the 12th instances of a, quote, same, quote, DNA molecule in it. That's an enormous amount of repetition going on. If any form of repetition does, by some Sheldrakean miracle, create a field, that's a hell of an important and extraordinarily powerful field. Now, you then imagine, look back at evolution and say, billions of years went by and then somebody came up with this spirally thing, and then a bit more repetition began to be possible. The same molecule was repeated not only in space at one moment, at the time of the event, but also in time, in this case, in Homo sapiens, over apparently 750,000 generations. So, creating numerical repetition on a scale almost beyond comprehension. Is it 1.75 times 10 to the 12th times 10 to the 5th? Is that the scale of repetition we're talking about over time and space? This particular DNA has established itself as a factor in humanity, and the repetition of it has been immense. So what happens? A human produces another human, and they come out just the same. I'm trying to get it across sort of intuitively without saying it in terms of Kant or whoever it was. It wasn't Kant, it was Hume. Well, I don't really know enough about it. So that's a truly massive repetition. But surely it must qualify for a high score in our calculus of degree of repetition. That's what I'm trying to get at, degree of repetition. I submit this as a valid candidate for a mechanism that can give the order that when a certain event occurs in, for example, a cell, the same form, whether it's an arrow or a leaf or whatever it is, will grow from it as did in previous generation. So we need to build a calculus just to be able to express, to master some understanding of the degree of repetition. That's what I'm after, trying to find out how do you express a degree of repetition. Can you?
Stephen, that's essentially what I did in my presentation earlier. So if you imagine that as a representation of the DNA molecule, and we discussed how we encoded this DNA molecule in binary.
Go 9 degrees left and do something like that.
Yeah. And so one of the questions that the honourable member to my left suggested was that the methodology established could be applied to DNA. That's on my list of things to do. So I have in place a mechanism to take the DNA in toto or in part and establish precisely and exactly the degree of order in each of its subparts. And so that's about 2 to 3 years' work to generalise this piece of work, which is complete. So that the essence of determining order and disorder in a long and complex molecule is on
your agenda.
On the agenda and on the question within the group. And so if we look at the last slide, Stephen was suggesting, Mark was suggesting we slow down. That last slide.
You want to go back?
Yeah, just the last
Let's
sentence.
go back.
The last sentence on that last slide. It's going to take me, which is a question I will address because it's so important. But that's a year's, or probably 2 years' work. Just to have the first stab at that using a known and extant methodology.
You could say that's what I fear.
And he has a biotropic function to calculate not only the entropy, but also the periodicity of these
So
encodings.
I've got a specific tool that has not previously existed in the scientific literature to do exactly that.
To, as it were, show, specify, create, to what degree that thing is a repetition.
Yeah, precisely, exactly.
Make those repetitions happen.
And to quantify it uniquely and express how and why it repeats.
Maybe you guys should exchange contact info.
Exchange or exchange is not very, very good. Very, very good. Where was I? Where am I going? Oh yes, my second guest tonight is the human brain cell and the nodes of connecting it with the means of connecting it, but they can make in a head with each other. Here, the physical scale, how far have we come from the somewhat subatomic, where this probably works, to the macro, where does it work? Is the physical scale is bigger than that of the DNA molecule, imagine. And the degree of repetition is at first sight not very large. The brain has 100 billion cells, which is only 10 to the 11th, much less than 10 to the 17th. That's still an awful lot of the same kind of thing in one place. Did you tell me that 10 to the 11th? The same thing in one place inside a head. That's unbelievable. It is, well, it is, yeah.
Are you assuming that one neuron is the same as the other?
No, I don't know enough about it. I'm talking cartoons here. I mean, I can't tell you what really goes on size-wise in the neurons. I'm only speculating. But I'm probably speculating well.
Maybe the synapses may be the things that you should be looking at rather than...
In which case you're talking a couple of orders of magnitude more than
Yes.
10 to the 11.
My next line
And in
says,
fact,
we have other degrees of repetition, not just the actual cells, whatever they're called, in the brain. We have their interconnections. Just from Wikipedia, I get linked by synapses. Each brain cell can connect to tens of thousands of others. So I say, nobody can read this, only the mathematician will be able to say at a glance how many possibilities are generated by that. Call it P, the number of possibilities. Is it 10 to the 11th times 10,000 factorial, perhaps? Wow, that's a lot of possibilities for the brain to take up one shape or another and pass what it's remembered to the future. As well as the degrees of multiple options involving these interconnections, suggesting that P memories will be held. We have a proposal that we actually can fix something in our brains for future memory by repeating it. It's a thing we do.
Practice makes perfect.
Thank you. You've probably reformed, sort of reported it, same thing, sort of tetrahedral expression for we learn at first by rote, we call it, by repeating it many times. The more you repeat it, the more you repeat it, you'll remember it tomorrow. What process is that? The one I've just described. You've got a brain that's got nothing happening in it. One thing happens in it. You repeat that one thing. He has the theory that it has to be happening in a part of your brain that is in a random state when you do it. So your brain tomorrow, you put yourself in a random state, say, just let me remember, and you go into a sort of state. Bit of your brain random picks it up because it was random. So that's all part of his theory, which I don't really know how to go into. So by holding an idea in memory, perhaps all day or for a lifetime, perhaps repeating it over and over, make it easy to remember. These processes are familiar to us. Thus, memory probably, see what this grammar of this long sentence is, memory probably succeeds in transmitting, it's actually across time to my brain tomorrow, we call that a memory, right? Transmits across time to my brain tomorrow, does it by having enormous hardware available for structuring separate concepts. This connects with that, all those, among the 10,000 it can connect with, and then the person with a different aspect is remembered slightly different, and so on. Millions of separate, the whole brain perhaps takes up, or a large part of it takes up a configuration to memorize something. Well, it's saw perhaps. And its memory succeeds in transmitting by practicing highly multiple repetition in that same structure. The same structure is key to his ideas. This is the same structure. So it's that same structure. Tomorrow, it's the same context in a different place and time that makes it able to pick it up. He also got an intelligent thing about ESP, in which brothers and sisters, people with very similar brains, can do ESP, but it helps that your brain is in random to be able to, for there to be able to be a new signal being put into a random state of affairs. Example, I just heard my mother was killed in a car crash. Total shock. Brain goes into total random and is thus able to transmit. So the sister, 1,000 miles away, gets a picture of the mother, blah, blah, blah. So, but he says, I don't want to talk about ESP, that's not respectable, let's not touch it. But it's an amusing side angle. So what was that? Here somewhere, right? Yeah. That's S. S is my idea of a function, just decide to say how similar, how high is the degree of repetition involved when a brain does something and repeats it to itself continuously. Makes a structure. If it repeats it all day, how much is going on? He says it may even be something similar to the case of DNA, but perhaps the multiple linking, which you link the whole brain to get one signal, perhaps only is employed in the local part of the brain. And also we have the fact that the physical size of the brain cells is much, much larger than the elements of DNA. So those are all arguments why the memory effect should be rather less reliable than the reproduction of living form effect of the DNA molecule. That's what we find in practice. I think I wrote that down here. This would be coherent with memory being less reliable than the survival of the species on the planet. Memory is not reliable. what we use as memory is very simple, expedient provided by evolution for we animals to experience something we can call consciousness and use it as a tool. Longer, write the word consciousness out longer, include memory, etc. These are the elements of similarity for which we need in mathematics a calculus to enable us to discuss and compare. I think that's the last. Yes, I've got about 5 other pages of how he figured it out, what he's trying to figure out, blah, blah, blah. But it's mainly a repetition of this, which is quite a good condensation. Right, so you've got 15 minutes to tell me what's wrong with it, or tell me what we can do. I think it's an incredibly elegant piece of, it's all his, it's not mine, I'm just expressing what he does. He's never here in August. So I couldn't get him to come 2 years ago, 2 years ago. Does
May I, with the greatest deference possible, make one or two suggestions?
I think we should.
We hear an awful lot about waveforms these days. Is an electron, does it have periodicity? Yes, of course it does. That doesn't mean it's described by a sine wave. In fact, I think there's fairly good experimental evidence that an electron is a series of probability points, here or here or here, not like that.
I never thought it was a sine wave, I've always thought of it as a Gaussian distribution. It might be anywhere, it could be in London. But
I'm talking points, it's either here or here, it's not in between. Just take a look at an electron diffraction photograph if you're looking at some kind of crystalline substance.
Yeah.
You have circles, they are lines, they are not bands, as you get with interference bands between diffraction with light or X-rays or whatever. So I would suggest that some form of analysis which is discrete in nature is what you need to solve your problem. I doubt whether you will find a calculus useful, though we have heard in the past, particularly from Lou, about discrete calculus. I suspect you will be summing series, and that will give you better answers.
I'm just using Newton as an example. He said, well, take a discrete and reduce it to infinitesimal size and see what we can say about it. I thought maybe doing that is what you call creating a calculus. It might have a completely different form from Newton's calculus.
All right.
I'm imagining. I mean, remember, I know very, very little,
but we
on this.
At this sort of level, it's a discrete world.
Which level? Subatomic level?
Yes.
Okay, so there is not a thing that is...
Probability points.
They're not a wave. They're not a Gaussian distribution.
No.
They're a set of points. Is that?
You
Sure.
put your finger on it when you said that nobody talks about particles anymore,
Yeah,
they talk
yeah.
about waves.
Yeah.
Mistake.
Okay. Anybody able to build on that?
I would like to just say amen to what Tony just said.
Just we used to get amen 2 syllables beginning.
I mean,
It's specious. You're saying it's all specious. He's talking himself into his... he's talking his right hand into his left hand. You're saying.
well, I thought you were right on. I think the phenomena that I think you'll get further with discrete math to look at it.
Okay, well, when I say, initially, Greaves thought it up as particles. Particles are similar, these 2 similar particles are. Then somebody comes along and says, no, that's not a particle, that's a wave. Okay, I don't need to call it a wave, I don't need to call it a set of discrete positions instead of a wave. I just, need to use the most realistic language possible.
Can I make a suggestion? Whether it's precisely sensible, I think depends upon the person involved that's looking at it. But the simplest form of similarity that I know that has been studied intensely is that of plane geometric similarity. And there is actually a defined mathematical term in Euclidean geometry that is exactly called similarity. and it is usually related, it is frequently related to the study of triangles, but also to other such objects with more sides and so on. And it becomes very apparent then that the word similarity in that context is being applied to a very particular small set of properties of that particular geometric figure, and that there are other things which can be attributed to it, other properties, which can distinguish those things classified as similar from each other, such as homotheity and other geometric properties, which in turn relate to the degree of turning of the object, and then also you can then think of the differences in the scale of the objects, and so you then begin to accrete a whole number of different properties onto that small class of geometric objects, and the proliferation then from there on of properties becomes enormous.
Yes,
Euclid has in his first book of elements, he has definitions. Euclid it has definitions of congruence and similarity in terms
he's
of
talking about
in terms of the proportion and relationships and congruence. In his first book.
that's understandable, but he's absolutely right when he says that one might be in Reading, the other might be in 90 degrees, the other might be on Thursday afternoon and not Monday afternoon, and you can take it to ridiculous degrees in your illustrating it. But what's his name is trying to go on about is we started off at subatomic level when the number of properties available is very limited. And then he says, but if I take something that's not quite so atomic level, where the similarity is not quite so high, but I repeat it billions of times, will I not get a similar effect? That's where we're going, trying to find out what we mean by how similar that thing is to that thing. And you've just said, well, if you're only talking about diagrams in a Euclid book, there's a million other things, which is quite true.
If you think just of the DNA string, there's a vast number of submolecular parts of that thing, and there's a significant proportion of them that are virtually identical. You might apply the word similar is a kind of vague term for it, but there's a certain proportion of them which vary even within
one individual.
Well, probably yes, but certainly between related individuals, mother and son, and so on, and the degree of variation, although it isn't very large, when taken across a population of individuals, becomes enormous.
Yes, certainly the phenotypic characteristics it gives expression to clearly become enormous.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's well known statistic that we share 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees.
Right, indeed.
But it'd be pretty easy to distinguish anybody in this room from a chimpanzee.
That's right, yeah.
I hope.
Maybe we have one more.
I totally agree with Ron, because and I think that it's an idea you find in Leibniz. You cannot talk about a degree of similarity only removing certain qualities or properties, which means that in Leibniz's idea, if I correctly understand it, the identity of indiscernibles means that a singular thing cannot be identical with another singular thing.
Yeah.
Your total argument is to prove that repetition makes a similarity converge going to the infinity to the complete a set of properties of something, but that's a limit, and I don't think it's the same thing.
Be very hard to quantify.
Yes,
Very hard.
because it's potentially
And for a start, you'd have to,
potentially infinite.
yeah, you'd have to apply a multiply scaling factor to it, something like a log of a log of a log of a log, or something of that order, to be able to even start to manipulate it.
And even that presupposes you're able to specify exactly the properties in question and impose a metric on those. I mean, because you drew attention to the notion of similarity transformations in Euclidean geometry, and the fact that they're actually a rather small subclass of transformation, very small subclass of transformation, which is slightly, well, that may be a red herring because there the notion of similarity is being used in a strict technical, clearly defined, rigorously mathematically defined sense. But all the same, I think it's significant because even there, where you've got the axiomatic method, gives you so much control over the properties that you're discussing, that you have exact mathematical characterization of them. Even there, it's clear. The idea, as Leibniz pointed out, the idea that you could have some kind of universal metric whereby you could compare the degree to which all of these things were converging to some is just a complete non-starter. And indeed, the very fact that you've got to establish some kind of metric to even be able to have that, to get that discussion started, whereas the properties of space extend far beyond the metric properties. There's the topological properties, there's conformal structure, there's all these other things. It seems to me the more one looks at it, even in the context of mathematical examples, the more some overarching notion of convergent similarity that doesn't already presuppose the notion of identity and difference, to get it started, is I'm afraid, a non-starter.
I'm not yet impressed with the notion of identity and difference. It's obviously something
you're not impressed by that. Well, I have to say, if you're not impressed by the notion of identity and difference, I don't know how you get around the world.
What I mean is, I don't understand how that applies, but I'm sure it probably does apply. It just sounds like high-powered philosophy, and I'm actually talking about real physical, actual things.
You don't think the notion of identity and difference is, it does seem to be as well as anything in our conceptual framework could be.
I'm talking about things that do have degrees of identity, are identical in some respects. You said we could break it down by respects, and you'll see there's an infinite number of respects. But what the nature of identity and difference is in the language of some 19th century philosopher, I'm afraid I don't know how to say. I know what identity is, I know what difference is.
Do you? Well done, because it's been the deepest problem, one of the most profound questions of the whole of Western metaphysics. Tell me your answer. I'd be fascinated there. What are identity and difference? It seems to me their notions so fundamental they can't be defined in terms of anything.
Last year, David Blake, is it Peter Blake? Andy Blake, he gave a speech and I wrote it down. I made 5 or 6 copies of that speech, and at the end of it, I'm going to give them out to you so you can. At the end of it, he says something like, I think it's the Jews or somebody says that is a dirty word. Which is actually goes to the concept of identity. I'll get those copies out.
Well, I don't know what that could mean, except so far as it's gesturing at some possible alternative framework, which I said, which one does have in certain Eastern traditions, that there could be some other way of thinking about, some kind of universal ordering principle that was other than the one that already rested on the notions of identity and difference. I'm not ruling out that possibility. I think David Burns' speculations about the notion of order, gesture in precisely such a direction. But I agree with you, we need to take a very, very deep breath here, step back and recognise that we're talking about matters which go right back to the very beginning of our entire cultural tradition of thinking about the world.
The most interesting thing is that Keynes' book on probability, which was written in 1921, before he wrote the General Theory,
yes, long time.
He wrote because he was very worried about probability in economics.
Yes.
And he knew that he had to he needed to counter the tendency of econometrics as it was becoming even then.
Yes, that's very interesting.
In order to actually have a reasonable stab at an economic theory that he thought might actually
How
happen.
far, can I just ask, just a question of information, I have a friend who's a historian of economic thought who's written about Keynes, and of course Keynes' father, John Neville Keynes, was John, I think, was his father, Neville Keynes, was also wrote about probability theory.
I didn't know that, right.
I think this is one of the reasons he was so interested in it. It was actually his father's particular field of expertise.
That book is genius. It's
Well, the man who wrote it was clearly a genius if anybody ever was. But yeah.
This extremely philosophical chat that Anthony Blake gave last year, at the end, at least in my notes, they're not properly written, it says, this is a perverted kind of verb. That goes to identity.
Can I suggest that
Let's
we
stop now. Give it out now.
formally thank
Yes.
Steve? You discuss, the discussion continues.
I want to give to anybody who would like it. I'm running commentary on Anthony Blake's speech last year, which I thought was marvellous. And if anyone would like, if anyone likes copies of what I said,